I'm Arden, 45. The night we buried my father, my family used my grief to make me guarantee their family deal. When the bank called the debt, I didn't argue, I documented. Tonight a judge will decide the company's fate, but the roots, the drivers, and the future are already protected under my name. I learned blood can be bought was the night my family priced me like a receipt. Atlas Haulage had always been my father's second heartbeat. A kitchen table company that grew into 3 warehouses and a fleet of trucks that wore our name like a promise. The memorial dinner was supposed to be about stories and casseroles, but Vivian staged it like a board meeting in disguise. Ironed tablecloth, polished grief, place cards with titles that no longer existed. Celeste arrived late, lacquered confidence and a smile that reflected candlelight back at itself, while Ruth, small and deliberate, patted the chair beside her and said, "Eat, child." I could taste lemons and gasoline in the air, that strange blend of comfort food and diesel that always clung to Dad's jackets. Instead of a eulogy, Vivian slid a leather portfolio across the table and said she wanted to honor his wishes. Inside the portfolio waited a temporary power of attorney and an amended shareholder agreement heavy with sweeteners and soft verbs. Celeste tapped a manicure against the signature lines and said the bank needed agility, that contracts were piling up, that Dad had hated delays. I read the clauses while the green beans cooled. Expanded authority for urgent financing, signature authority over operating accounts, and a cross-default clause I didn't like at all. Ruth squeezed my hand under the table as if to remind me that love should be faster than caution. Vivian cooed about momentum, about not letting grief stall the business, about how Dad trusted us to act like a unit. "We need your signature tonight for the bank," she said, pressing a pen into my blang. I palmed the way doctors press a stethoscope, listening for consent more than granting care. I signed. Not because I agreed, but because peacemaking had been my job since childhood, and I wanted one night without an argument written across the napkins. I took photos of every page under the table with my phone, mailed the scans to myself from the restroom, and told myself I would call our bookkeeper in the morning. For dessert, Celeste toasted the next chapter with a practiced catch in her voice. Ruth dabbed the corner of her eye. Vivian laughed with the relief of a plan accepted. A week later, while I was approving driver bonuses and juggling insurance renewals, a line item appeared on the operating account like a bruise. A bridge loan I had never seen. Proceeds wired to 2 consultants whose addresses mapped to the same strip mall mailbox. The memos were vague: strategy audit, market acceleration, and the dates sat too close together to be honest. Jade, our cousin who treats celebration like a side hustle, posted a champagne boomerang with the caption, "New chapter, new checks," and tagged Celeste's LLC as if discretion were passé. I called the bookkeeper and asked for invoices, EINs, and IP logs. I asked him to forward me every authorization request with timestamps and routing numbers. The pattern curled up like smoke. Same-day invoices approved at odd hours, wires executed minutes later, memos edited in a way that left a shine. When I asked Vivian to slow down, she said I was emotional, not fiscal, and wagged the signed documents at me like a hall pass. Celeste said the industry was evolving and that I was still driving a map when everyone else used GPS. Ruth looked at her lap and twisted a napkin into a rope. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked like a metronome, trying to keep us honest. I excused myself before honesty turned into spectacle. In Dad's office, I found his leather planner still smelling faintly of coffee and motor oil, and slid it into my bag the way you pocket a compass before walking into fog. If they wanted me compliant, they would now get me meticulous. No more conversations without evidence. I set alerts on every account, exported 12 months of statements, and created a chain of custody spreadsheet that would make a prosecutor yawn with satisfaction. I summarized what I'd seen in a neutral email to myself and blind copied a folder only I could open. On the drive home, the dashboard glowed blue and solemn while I rehearsed sentences that used verbs and dates instead of outrage. Halfway to my condo, my phone vibrated with a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. A banker named Micah whose tone carried the careful urgency of someone pulling a fire alarm politely. "Arden, I think you don't know what you just guaranteed." Micah met me in a glass-walled conference room that smelled faintly of toner and caution. She was precise without being cold, the kind of banker who irons facts instead of feelings. She slid a copy of the credit line across to me and tapped 2 clauses I had skimmed in grief and politeness. The temporary power of attorney had allowed Celeste to pledge Atlas assets against a new facility secured not only by company receivables, but by a personal continuing guarantee I'd consented to with my signature at that memorial dinner. I felt the air thin and made myself breathe anyway. She explained the tripwire like a teacher who refuses to dramatize fire drills. If covenants broke coverage ratios, liquidity thresholds, material adverse change, the bank could accelerate. The collateral schedule listed Atlas inventory first, then a quiet appendix naming my condo, and finally an ugly rider. Transfer of my voting shares into a springing trust if the default stuck for 10 business days. I don't think you understood what you guaranteed, Micah said gently, echoing her message. My stomach ricocheted off my ribs, but I kept my voice even. Panic is a poor editor. I asked for full statements, draw histories, and user logs. She printed while I steadied my hands with a paper cup of water I didn't drink. I left the bank without theatrics and went straight to work. Rage performs, documentation decides. Back at my desk, I downloaded every statement and reconciled balances like a paramedic counting fingers. I requested ACH and wire audit trails, set threshold alerts on every account, and froze discretionary draws pending temporary review. I wrote a neutral email to Vivian and Celeste noting routine reconciliations and copied the bookkeeper to make silence expensive. Then I created a folder called Rope, because names help you remember what tools are for. Blythe, a forensic accountant May once called a bloodhound in pearls, joined me on a video call with her sleeves already metaphorically rolled. She asked for vendor EINs, invoice PDFs, IP submission logs, and the approval workflow routing table. I granted view-only access to our banking portal and watched her build a tidy lattice of tabs that looked like a bridge across a gorge. She spoke sparingly and typed like a pianist. "We'll follow structure, not vibes," she said, and I felt my pulse swerve back toward logic. May, my oldest friend, insisted I move into her guest room until the floor stopped tilting. She cleared a wall and pulled out a whiteboard stained with the ghosts of past projects. We mapped people, entities, and timing, Vivian's trust, Celeste's LLCs, Jade's social breadcrumb trail, the registered agent address that kept popping up like an uninvited chorus. We stuck color-coded notes above dates until the constellations started resembling intent. At midnight, May shoved tea into my hands and told me to sleep. I did, but with a pen uncapped on the nightstand like a talisman. By morning, Blythe had gathered enough anomalies to sketch a pattern. 2 consultant LLCs billed in alternating weeks, identical formatting, nearly identical amounts, and matching registered agents. Both listed mailing addresses at the same strip mall mailbox. Timestamps on invoice submissions traced to our office IP. But the connectivity logs showed a phone hotspot identifier that matched Celeste's device history. "Convenient agility," Blythe murmured, which was her version of rolling her eyes. I cataloged the details, careful with adjectives, greedy with dates. Syra, the corporate attorney Micah recommended, read my scan of the documents and went still in the way good lawyers do when the wind changes. "They overreached badly," she said, index finger resting on the fiduciary duty paragraph in the shareholder agreement. Her plan was a pressure cooker, not a splash. Let them perform on paper until the record wrote itself. Then invoke the clause they had failed to respect duty of loyalty and prohibition against self-dealing. We would not shout fraud. We would escort the numbers into the danger room and let them speak. I kept my tone pleasant in the family group chat, nodding at Celeste's buzzwords and Vivian's assurances that innovation requires trust. I said I was eager to streamline, then quietly revoked a dormant bank token still tied to my credentials. A background notification blinked that the token had been used last month to approve a vendor batch at an odd hour. I archived the alert and did not mention it. Every yes I typed bought me another inch of rope. Operational hygiene became my liturgy. I changed passwords, rotated keys, and disabled catch-all email forwarding rules I hadn't created. I notarized an affidavit clarifying the limited consent I intended when I signed, and Syra filed a preservation letter demanding all records be retained intact. I opened a separate legal budget, my war chest, and auto-populated it with the little windfalls a life accumulates when you stop apologizing for being precise. I scheduled calendar blocks called breathing so the crisis wouldn't colonize my lungs. Blythe's first flowchart arrived near dusk, clean as an operating room. Colored arrows traced money from the credit line to the consultants, then to Celeste's LLC, leaping again into a family trust that was not mine. The labels were polite. The implication was not. At the very bottom, a box waited in Blythe's dry, merciless font. Funds cycle through Celeste's LLC and land in Vivian's trust. Accounting does not love me or them, it only loves sequence. Blythe opened a folder named Trail and stacked proofs like bricks, ledger extracts, time-stamped ACH logs, approval stamps, and the IP addresses used to submit every suspicious invoice. She didn't perform outrage, she indexed it. Numbers lined up the way trucks line at dawn, first in, first out, no skipping. Harper, the licensed investigator with the librarian voice, pulled corporate records on the Shell LLCs and their obliging registered agent. Mailboxes turned into maps, formation dates kissed wire dates, addresses overlapped like tracing paper. The timeline stopped feeling like smoke and started feeling like a hallway with doors I could knock. I filmed screen captures as I logged in, downloaded bank proofs, and copied hashes into a chain of custody spreadsheet that would bore a movie but impress a judge. Every file got a timestamp, a brief description, and a signature from my calmer self tomorrow. I wrote nothing that guessed intent. Verbs and dates are kinder to the truth than adjectives. Micah called discreetly and walked me through the covenants again, her tone steady like cruise control. One more draw at their current burn and the bank would call the line, accelerating everything that terrified me on page 7. I pictured my condo appearing on a spreadsheet as casually as a paperclip and tasted metal. Syra drafted a preservation letter to Vivian and Celeste, a pleasant grenade that required them to retain all communications, devices, and drafts, with spoliation explicitly on the table. I read it aloud softly, letting the legal verbs polish my spine. Meanwhile, Pilar, a mobile notary with a calm stamp, witnessed my revocation notice for non-essential authorities I never meant to grant. I scheduled a board meeting with proper notice and an agenda that could survive a spotlight. Vivian replied with ellipses that pretended to be patience. Celeste sent a laughing emoji that said more than her MBA. I printed both and paper-clipped them to the minutes template because sometimes receipts are lowercase. Blythe called at dusk and pointed to a duplicate invoice pattern that wore a new lipstick each week. Same amounts, slightly altered memos, identical metadata, all filed under the friendly veil of marketing. It was laundering with manners, and the manners were thin. I added the cluster to the exhibit list and felt the strange peace that comes when the story stops arguing with itself. Micah asked how I wanted to handle the next draw, and I surprised us both by saying to let a small one proceed. Catching it in real time would be cleaner than blocking it. The audit trail would write with fresh ink and a timestamp no one could claim was smudged by memory. I set my phone to bark at any movement above $2,000 and placed the charger like a perimeter. The transfer hit mid-morning, a neat chunk labeled Consulting Sprint that moved from the credit line to the usual mailbox entity. Harper stood outside the linked branch an hour later and photographed Jade withdrawing cash with sunglasses big enough to hide a conscience. Blythe pinned the images next to the wire confirmation. Syra stapled them to the preservation letter addendum. Micah logged the event for compliance. I spent the afternoon assembling a narrative that needed no narrator, a stack where each page answered the page before it. Dates, kissed deposits, invoices echoed memos, devices nodded from their metadata like shy witnesses. By dusk, even my fear respected the order. I texted Micah a thank you for tolerating my obsession and cleaned the whiteboard at Maze, leaving the timeline intact and the insults erased. We ate soup over the sink like students and tried not to name the relief that kept peeking around the corner. Then my phone lit up with a message that straightened my posture before I read it. Micah, the bank's compliance wants to meet tomorrow. Someone tipped them about fraud. I stared at the blue light washing Maze tiles and felt the familiar mix of dread and relief that arrives when secrets choose to walk into fluorescent rooms. Tomorrow would not be theater. It would be math, microphones, signatures, and the ledger speaking for itself. I told Micah we'd meet on the bank's turf, but on my terms. Everything in writing, cameras on, audio recorded, exhibits marked as we referenced them. Syra slid into the glass conference room at my side with a pad, 2 pens, and the kind of stillness that shifts a room's gravity. Compliance arrived as a trio, one with questions, one with a laptop, one with a face that said he'd heard every story twice. Vivian opened with maternal warmth, the temperature of cocoa, telling them how hard the year has been and how families pull together. Celeste performed competence, crisp blazer and a lean-forward posture, saying agile and market velocity and temporary controls like she was seasoning a stew. Jade hovered as an assistant, ferrying folders that were thinner than the promises they implied. I stuck to verbs and dates. When they asked, I answered with timestamps and contracts, nothing that required adjectives to stand up. Micah's team projected the vendor roster and asked, almost gently, why the EINs for our 2 busiest consultants mapped to a mailbox store off Memorial Road. Celeste smiled and explained we were lean and distributed, that consultants prefer discretion. I marked the moment, the tone, the angle of her chin, the way Vivian nodded before the answer finished. Syra slid an exhibit toward the camera, a printout of the Secretary of State records for both LLCs, same registered agent, same suite number that wasn't a suite at all. The compliance lead didn't frown. He annotated. Noted, he said, and I felt the oxygen return to my lungs in a measured trickle. I presented proof without throat clearing. The IP logs from our office at the exact times the invoices had been uploaded, cross-referenced with a tether identifier that belonged to Celeste's phone. No accusations, just a neat table with 3 columns and an index that credited the network vendor directly. Blythe, on video from her tidy office, narrated the duplicate invoice clusters that marched across the months like copy-paste choreography, same amounts, near-identical memos, identical metadata, alternating LLC names. Harper followed with bank ATM footage time-stamped, 1 hour after a specific transfer, Jade withdrawing cash at the very branch linked to the mailbox entity's account. She didn't editorialize, only matched frames to the corresponding ledger entries. Syra kept our pace unhurried, never chasing outrage, as if we had all the time in the world and the math did too. Compliance recessed for 15 minutes, then returned with the decision that mattered more than any speech. The credit line was paused under internal review. No further draws without dual approvals. My condo, they added, would be logged out of collateral pending resolution and interim safeguard based on the documents we produced. Micah didn't look at me. She looked at the screen and said, documented, as the note-taking officer typed. Vivian's smile thinned. Celeste rearranged her pen, the only sign something had slipped. I neither celebrated nor sighed. I opened my notebook and wrote 2 words, air pocket. Syra used that pocket. She served a formal demand for books and records. Under my shareholder rights they had conveniently forgotten still applied. Emails, texts, draft invoices, device backups, vendor contracts, routing approvals, all of it. The compliance trio didn't object. They logged it and thanked us for the clarity. I pivoted to my amicable proposal, voice even. If they wanted unchallenged control of Atlas, I would sell my shares at a formal valuation, independent and robust. The number I named would flatter their self-image without insulting my intelligence. Vivian exhaled like a prayer answered. Finally, you're being reasonable, she said, mistaking composure for surrender. She didn't notice that Syra's term sheet included appraisal standards. We curated methodologies that rewarded cash flow discipline and penalized self-dealing risk. Greed is loud, safeguards are quiet. The meeting ended with a calendar invite for document exchange and a politely worded freeze that functioned like a lock. In the elevator, Celeste whispered that I had grown up and that Dad would be relieved we weren't fighting in public. I pressed the lobby button and counted floors instead of sins. On the sidewalk, I called Rowan, my silent partner with the gift for reading weather 2 counties away, and said the line I'd rehearsed alone, Greenlight Ariadne. By sundown, Ariadne Logistics LLC existed clean, funded, and purpose-built. We filed to purchase operating assets from secured creditors if Atlas tripped covenants. Routes, driver agreements, software licenses, key leases, server racks with 0 interest in stock or legacy liabilities. They could keep the crown. I would buy the castle walls. Back at Maze, we built the second track under the first. While Vivian cooed to appraisers and Celeste curated optics, Rowan prepared term sheets tied to continuity. Syra drafted an asset purchase in the language of rescue, and Blythe mapped what a covenant failure would trigger by statute. The plan wasn't a trap. It was a bridge that waited to be the only crossing left. I answered family messages with cordial emojis and forwarded their substance into a folder titled Opera. The real music lived in folders named Structure and Proof. At 9:30, as I rinsed a coffee cup that had seen better news, my burner phone pinged with a message from an address that looked like a typo. No greeting, no signature, just a sentence that put every line we'd drawn into motion. Your sister is meeting a private buyer to strip equipment tonight. Harper shadowed Celeste to a rented warehouse on the edge of the industrial park, the kind with corrugated size and a keypad that pretends to be security. Through the cracked bay door, a so-called buyer paced with a clipboard, photographing our forklifts, pallet jacks, server racks, and labeling everything like a preluded estate sale. I stayed on the sidewalk, lens trained through chain link, whispering serial numbers into my phone so each shot married a timestamp and a proof. Harper logged plate numbers and the courier badges, while I texted Syra a neat list labeled, in unamused caps, not for sale. By the time the buyer measured our server rails, I had photographed the MAC stickers and the asset tags like birth certificates. Syra filed for a temporary restraining order before dinner, her affidavit stapled to exhibits that showed the mailbox LLCs and the matching withdrawals. Micah's team, already spooked by duplicate invoices, froze discretionary disbursements and flagged equipment transfers as high risk. The freeze landed like a polite anvil. Doors could still open, but nobody wanted to test the hinges. For optics, I scheduled my share sale to them for the end of the month, a calendar event with a price that sparkled and terms hiding teeth. Covenants demanded audited statements, clean vendor lists, and a post-closing escrow that would choke any siphon attempting a final gulp. Vivian called it generous, Syra called it containment. I called it bait the fish were eager to bite. Meanwhile, Ariadne Logistics sent quiet letters to Atlas's secured creditors, offering to buy operating assets if covenants failed routes, driver agreements, software licenses, leaseholds, the usable marrow without the bone spurs. I handed them what they wanted, control and appearance, while negotiating separately for everything that actually moves freight and people. They posed with titles. I priced the engines. Blythe's stress test ran the numbers forward with the discipline of a metronome, showing Atlas would trip covenants in 21 days at their current burn, conveniently the week before payroll. She circled fuel, insurance, and a vanity consultant retainer as the three blades spinning closest to the jugular. Rowan arranged standby factoring and drafted offer letters so drivers wouldn't have to wait for someone else's learning curve. Vivian, feeling bulletproof, held court at a brunch spot with marble tables, gloating about finally modernizing without my anxiety and clinking crystal, while Jade filmed bubbles catching the light like loyal little planets. I watched the clip once, muted, then put my phone face down and set a timer for a nap. May reminded me that strategy breaks when sleep does, so I tucked my phone in a shoe to hear every vibration and surrendered to 30 responsible minutes. The share buyout closed with smiles that photographed well. I signed, posed, and wired the proceeds straight into escrow for the asset purchase, a current carrying purpose instead of victory. There was no champagne, only a checklist, a banker's stamp, and a quiet yes to the next step. On paper, they had the crown. In motion, I was already moving the castle walls. That night, the warehouse lights hummed like rumor, and my inbox stacked confirmations the way dominoes lean before an arranged fall. Micah forwarded an internal memo noting elevated default probability. Syra sent the sign TRO. Blythe pinged a green check beside each serial number I had captured. I walked the apartment once, checked the Go folder, and let the refrigerator's steady motor talk me down to even. Just before midnight, my phone lit the ceiling in cold blue. Micah's text was a sentence that turned the gears visible. I sat up in the half-dark, slid my feet into sneakers, opened the Go folder, and felt the room tilt from theory to practice. From folders to trucks. From proof to movement. I texted Rowan, cued the escrow instructions, set 3 alarms, and told my nerves to behave like adults who have already rehearsed for this exact kind of night. Micah texted, they missed a payment. Bank will accelerate the line at 9 a.m. At 9 a.m. On the dot, the email from Micah's bank arrived with the sterile kindness of a clinical diagnosis. Due to covenant breaches and unpaid charges, the revolving line was accelerated, effective immediately. In one sentence, Atlas under Vivian and Celeste's command was in technical default, and all the soft assurances they'd rehearsed at brunch crashed against the single, unfriendly word, payable. I watched the notice propagate like weather. Vendors tightened. Fuel cards pinged, locked at pumps across 2 counties. Dispatch screens stalled, routes blinking orange, then red, as if the map itself were embarrassed. My phone lit in chorus with driver names I'd saved years ago, steady voices asking what was happening, not in anger yet, but in the thin tone people use when they're balancing rent, childcare, and a tank that won't fill. I didn't gloat. Gravity doesn't need narration. I acted. Rowan and I pushed Ariadne's offer from polish to live, an agreement to assume key customer contracts, yard leases, and software licenses under a going concern sale if the receiver approved, with a bridge schedule for immediate service continuity. We'd front the transition and honor seniority. We'd issue new fuel cards by end of shift. The packet was lean on adjectives and heavy on calendars, phone trees, and names that would answer at 2 a.m. We sent it to the bank, to Micah, to the lawyers on copy, and to the appointed inbox that swallows emergencies and spits out permissions. Syra filed the receivership motion before coffee cooled, her declaration mounted with the ledger chains Blythe built, the IP logs, the mailbox addresses, and the tidy list of assets Celeste had tried to scoot out the side door. The motion wasn't a taunt. It was a seatbelt for customers, employees, and collateral, asking the court to install a neutral to keep the engine from tearing itself apart in public. We proposed a candidate with a reputation for unglamorous fairness, punctual, unpersuadable, and allergic to theater. I reread our exhibit list and realized how calm paperwork can be when you stop asking it to be dramatic. Vivian called Micah's compliance lead and then me, pleading for 1 more week as if time could be extended like a coupon. Compliance pointed to the siphoning pattern, to duplicate invoices in neat pairs, to the photos of Jade withdrawing cash after transfers labeled strategy, to a covenant letter ignored. "We're past extensions," the voice said, not unkindly. I kept my answer to a sentence that fit inside the law. "We're prepared to stabilize operations today under a court-appointed receiver." The silence that followed sounded like someone setting down a glass without looking where the table is. I began dialing. Core drivers first, then dispatch leads, then the night shift mechanics who keep everything from rattling apart. I didn't promise the moon. I promised offer letters, same or better pay, benefits day 1, and a hotline that rang to a person rather than a maze. If they preferred their current routes, we would mirror them. If they wanted a switch, we'd ask where the stress lives and relieve it. I told them we were treating experience like treasure, not trivia. Ask the questions people ask when the ground twitches. Will my hours count? Can I keep my Friday run? What about my PTO? I answered with specifics because dignity travels on details. Meanwhile, Harper drove to the warehouse where Celeste's buyer had been sniffing. The TRO had teeth, and the would-be deal died in a parking lot conversation documented by a clipboard and a shrug. Equipment that had inched toward the door returned to its lines, serial numbers checked against the list I'd photographed, each one a small victory written in bolts and barcodes. Blythe, already building a spreadsheet for transition with color-coded columns, matched employees to roles, roles to routes, and routes to customer promises that would not be broken on our watch. Rowan confirmed short-term factoring that would cover payroll even if wires arrived late. We would not ask anyone to pay for leadership's tuition in consequences. I kept repeating the line I'd written at the top of my notebook when this started. Be lawful. Be humane. Be firm. No online drama. Only paper. When Jade's video teased haters, I didn't reply. I sent another PDF. Transition contacts, receiver motion docket, fuel card distribution schedule, warehouse access hours. I asked May to assemble welcome folders, paper copies of offer letters, benefits summaries, a coffee gift card tucked into the back pocket, because the first thing you touch on a new job should tell you that someone thought ahead. By mid-afternoon, customers who had been watching the weather called our temporary hotline and heard a human, We were ready to cover tonight's loads. They were ready to sign continuity addenda, and the receiver candidate's scheduler penciled a 4:30 hearing. I walked the yard with a legal pad, writing down things that don't fit on spreadsheets. A driver's nervous joke, a dispatcher's mascara holding on, the smell of rain trapped in canvas tarps, that stubborn sensation that the place had memory even if people tried to spend it. When the calendar alert chimed for the hearing, I sat in the back row of the small courtroom with Syra. Our binders aligned like well-behaved bricks. Vivian and Celeste arrived with matching scarves and a posture that begged for sympathy's lens. The bank sent a pair in conservative ties that called themselves facts. The judge scanned our motion, scanned the exhibits, asked 2 questions that cut to bone, and glanced at the receiver candidate with a nod that read like punctuation. The gavel didn't slam. The order read as quiet as a library. Temporary receivership granted, neutral appointed, continued service prioritized, all transfers frozen pending inventory and plan. I watched the clerk stamp the page, ink blooming into certainty, and felt the room tilt from story to schedule. The neutral looked up, met my eyes without ceremony, and said he'd be at the yard within the hour. The receiver arrived without entourage, wearing a windbreaker instead of a robe, and turned the warehouse into a checklist. He started at the East Bay, reading asset tags aloud while an assistant typed. I shadowed with my serial number list, calling out matches like bingo that refuses to cheer. Forklifts, pallet jacks, handheld scanners, server racks, dock plates, each number clicked into place. Preparation made his job easy. The floor agreed with the ledger. When he reached the last row, he nodded once and said, almost kindly, "Thank you." Vivian tried to turn inventory into theater, explaining that the disputed vendors were part of misunderstood innovation and that disruption always looks messy from the loading dock. Celeste tried another tack, pointing at me and describing a hostile sister engineering a coup. The receiver didn't rise to either invitation. He asked for keys, badges, alarm codes, and access cards, his voice level as a scale. When Celeste stalled, he wrote non-compliant beside her name and kept moving, unimpressed by our family's talent for monologues. Receivership changed the rules of gravity. Under his authority, offers could be accepted for going concern sales no more, whisper deals in parking lots, no more fire sales dressed as agility. We filed Ariadne's bid exactly as we'd rehearsed. Keep roots intact, retain current staff with seniority recognized, honor every customer SLA on paper, and pay secured creditors cleanly. It read like a service manual, not a manifesto. The receiver glanced through and said he appreciated verbs. The competing bidder arrived late and loud, carrying spreadsheets that looked swollen with optimism but malnourished by cash. Their counsel spoke in marketing, verbs unlock, turbocharge, amplify until the judge asked about payroll coverage and fuel. Syra, seated at my right, adjusted her glasses and walked the math with surgical patience, line by line, until the optimism deflated into the simple admission that their proof of funds was conditional. Undercapitalized and hostile is a risky combination. The courtroom preferred continuity over charisma. Customers submitted declarations that landed with the weight of punctual deliveries. They described how Ariadne had quietly stabilized routes during the acceleration scare, how calls were returned by humans, how Saturday dispatch sounded calm instead of brittle. One logistics manager attached a simple chart: missed windows before, 0 after. Another wrote that his night crew stopped bringing pillows because freight moved again. In a process allergic to adjectives, those paragraphs functioned like torque. Even the bank's counsel nodded at their utility. Nyla, Micah's unflappable compliance assistant, confirmed Ariadne's funding package with a 2-line email and 3 attachments that did more than any speech could do. The bank, hungry for predictability, nodded toward solvency. The receiver made a note. The judge marked the calendar. Vivian leaned close as we waited for the next matter to be called and whispered that Dad would be ashamed of my hostility. I answered softly that Dad taught me to keep trucks rolling, not egos. The receiver overheard and, without looking up, asked for the spare keys. Back at the yard, the receiver's team set up a folding table, a printer, and an inbox that drank paper calmly. Inventory sheets stacked, badge lists updated. The new fuel cards arrived in a padded envelope like relief in plastic form. Rowan finalized vendor terms that made continuity cheap and grandstanding expensive, while May drafted onboarding packets with HR templates, and Dignity baked in no clip art smiles, just clear pay schedules, benefits, dates, and phone numbers that ring to people. I walked the aisles and felt the building exhale into the rhythm of work. The receiver filed his recommendation 2 days later, concise and unsentimental. Accept Ariadne's bid and schedule an expedited sale. Hearing. There were no flourishes in the language, just verbs that move freight. I read the PDF on my phone in the break room while a microwave counted down someone's lunch, and for the first time in months the humming sounded like order rather than dread. We circled the hearing date in red, set task lists by hour, and rehearsed answers that used numbers like handrails. Then Jade leaked a glossy hit piece calling me a vulture, and a reporter demanded comment minutes before the hearing began. The reporter waited by the courthouse steps with a microphone and a question shaped like a trap, but I walked past without changing pace, letting my silence do the editing. Syra released a 3-sentence statement we had polished until it gleamed with restraint, protecting jobs, customers, and creditors, respecting the court's process, focusing on continuity, not controversy. No adjectives about anyone's character, no counterpunches for Jade's clip, just the mission folded into verbs. The wind carried the word continuity down the stone corridor like a chord you can't hum wrong. Inside, I turned off notifications and let the building's hush settle my pulse into something that could hold a pen. The competing bidder opened with theater, projecting a deck full of arrows and fireworks metaphors as if logistics were a parade waiting for a drumline. They promised acceleration, amplification, disruption, the vocabulary of people who think volume equals velocity. The judge lifted a hand, not unkind, and asked for math, proof of funds, payroll coverage dates, fuel strategy under locked cards, the cost of honoring existing service-level agreements. Their counsel shuffled papers, made a lap around jargon, and landed on conditional language that wilted under fluorescent lights. He tried a second pass. The judge repeated the question as a number. Blythe took the stand with the composure of a librarian who knows exactly where the rare book sits. She did not accuse. She arranged. Exhibits A through G walked through invoice clusters with identical metadata, IP submissions from our office tethered to Celeste's device, withdrawals aligned to wires labeled strategy. She pointed to dates, not conclusions, and let the pattern narrate itself with the patience of a metronome. The word fraud never left her mouth, the numbers wore it anyway. Syra, at our table, tracked each page with a pen that clicked only to mark alignment. Across the aisle, Vivian kept her chin high. Celeste stared at the edge of the lectern, as if the wood might argue on her behalf. Customers testified by affidavit, the kind of letters that smell like night shifts and coffee lids. One attached a chart showing missed windows the week of acceleration and 0 misses after Ariadne stepped in quietly. Another described how our dispatcher answered at 2 a.m., with the same tone she used at noon. A warehouse manager wrote that his team stopped sleeping in the break room because loads started. Moving again, clocks made honest. No cheerleading, no flourishes, just proof that service had resumed its steady heartbeat. The affidavit stack was thin on glamour and thick with logistics, which is to say it did the job. The receiver's report followed, concise and unsentimental. He recommended our bid as the one most likely to preserve value for creditors and continuity for customers, and he underlined that staff retention under Ariadne's plan exceeded any alternative presented. Nyla, calm as weather, confirmed Ariadne's funding in 2 clean paragraphs with account certifications attached. The bank's counsel nodded toward solvency as if pointing out a familiar landmark. Union reps, after reviewing wage schedules and seniority recognition, inclined their heads with the kind of approval that does not gush. The air in the room shifted from argument to architecture. The judge approved the state law equivalent of a 363 sale, granting the transfer of assets to Ariadne free and clear of claims, with the receiver to oversee closing mechanics. The gavel did not thunder, the clerk's stamp did, ink spreading into certainty over signatures that had rehearsed for this exact moment. Vivian gasped the way people do when curtains fail to rise on cue. Celeste bent over her phone and texted Jade with furious precision, thumbs a staccato beat. I watched the stamped order dry and felt the room flip from noise to instructions. Badges, fuel cards, route charts, offer packets, clocks. Out in the yard, I didn't make a speech. I handed out paper, offer letters on top, healthcare dates highlighted, a schedule board laminated against smudges, and a contact list with names that picked up. May hung the route chart by the dock door with quiet satisfaction, and Rowan moved through the rows, distributing new fuel cards that slid into wallets like permission. Someone clapped once, tentative. Someone else answered. Applause gathered itself without a conductor, the kind that rises when relief finally remembers how to breathe. I felt the building's old tension loosen like a knot you stop pretending is jewelry. Back in the office, I signed a check to secured creditors with the relief of closing a bracket. Numbers balanced, obligations met. I wrote a thank you card to Micah's team because professionalism is also a ledger entry, and tucked it beside the envelope for the receiver. Syra filed our notice of closing milestones. Blythe printed a final reconciliation. Harper archived photos in a folder labeled, with dates. We loaded a cart with welcome folders, coffee, and a box of donuts that tasted like an apology to the night shift's patients. My phone buzzed once, then glowed with a single-line email from Vivian. Subject bare, body colder than marble. You took everything. I stared at the sentence long enough to feel the weight she wanted me to carry and set it down in a place with no handles. Then I typed a reply that neither defended nor danced, a sentence that fit in the space her choices created and refused to borrow any shame. You kept what you valued. Ariadne's first week felt like putting a spine back into a body. Trucks rolled out on time, badge scanners stopped sulking, and dispatch sounded like grown-ups instead of fire alarms. I authorized small driver bonuses tied to clean safety logs and made sure the deposits arrived before congratulations did. 2 anchor customers renewed early, each request packaged not with flattery but with the same plain sentence, whatever you did between Tuesday and Thursday, please keep doing it. We did. Schedules stabilized, late penalties evaporated, and the yard started smelling like diesel and relief instead of denial. Culture is a system, not a slogan, so I wrote 3 rules on a whiteboard and initialed them like policies. Dashcam privacy baked into settings and sign notices, transparent pay with lanes, rates, and overtime math on paper, and a no-yelling rule at dispatch with consequences that didn't require a meeting to enforce. Nobody argued. People who thrive on confusion find other hobbies when the lights stay on. We set a real complaints inbox that routed to May and me, and we answered every note inside 48 hours with the adult elegance of specifics. Rowan negotiated bulk fuel, the way a chess player captures the center quietly. Cents shaved became dollars, saved became room to breathe. Blythe closed open loops left by receivership 2 stray credits, a vendor duplicate, and a lease clause with a stinger until our books read like boring bedtime stories. May built a small training library, forklift refreshers, hazmat refreshers, 2-page guides for new tablets that didn't assume anyone enjoys manuals. Morale didn't spike, it settled. Men who had learned to shrug before asking anything started stopping by my door to say, "I've got an idea." Like ideas were safe again. I moved my father's desk into a small conference room and framed his route map under glass, a reminder that legacy is a trailhead, not a shrine. I don't talk to the map. I talk to the people who drove the lines he drew, and the people who will redraw them better. At lunch, I run my hand along the nick near the top drawer where he used to pry stuck pens and tell myself I'm building something that doesn't ask for permission to be decent. It helps to have wood that remembers what steadiness feels like. Predictably, Vivian and Celeste reappeared as consultants in search of clients. They sent an invoice for introductions monetized, which is the kind of phrase that tries to pass for legitimacy by wearing expensive shoes. Syra returned a letter with 2 words that carry more dignity than paragraphs. Request declined. I forwarded it to the receiver for the file and returned to payroll timing, which still ranks higher in my religion than anyone's appetite for applause. Female-on-female competition, a frame so tired it should qualify for early retirement. Employees responded by posting something better than arguments, screenshots of pay arriving on time, fuel cards working at pumps, and schedule texts that didn't move the finish line mid-shift. I didn't like the theater, but I respected the rebuttal. The algorithm can't drown a deposit. With sale proceeds and the judge's order finalized, I paid down the accelerated balance and closed that chapter with the practical ceremonial of a cashier's check sliding under glass. Micah answered with a single punctuation mark, a period in a smiley because sometimes bankers celebrate like monks. We sent pastries to her team with a note that said, "Thank you for expecting receipts." You'd be surprised how far civility travels in an envelope. Expansion invites arrived dressed in urgency. I chose restraint. We piloted a night shift microhub at a client's backlot. Small, measured, and boring in the best way. 2 trailers, 8 dock slots, 1 supervisor who likes checklists, and a rule that nothing innovative happens after midnight without 2 signatures. On-time percentages crept up. Fuel burn crept down. The yard learned to exhale without waiting for permission. Every improvement earned its verb before it earned a headline. The buyout gain from my share sale sat in escrow for an hour and then left for a scholarship in my father's name, CDL training for people who can't afford to surprise a paycheck. Vivian forwarded my announcement with the comment, "Stunting," as if generosity were a runway. I didn't reply. I was busy reading the first thank you email from a student who wanted to drive nights to cover mornings with her kid, and some messages don't share space with noise. By Friday, our route chart showed fewer red marks than my calendar had seen in months. I let myself sit at Dad's desk for 5 minutes. No calculator, no pen, just the steady hum of the refrigeration units and a yard foreman laughing at something small and good. That was the exact second the lobby door clicked and a man wearing an apologetic tie asked for me by full name, middle initial included. He held a folder with tabs, the color of warning labels, and a voice that trained itself not to sound accusatory. "Service of process for Arden Hale," he said, confirming my identity twice before offering the papers like a fragile tray. Vivian and Celeste had filed a lawsuit alleging tortious interference, as if rescuing a burning root were the same as stealing the matchbook. I signed the acknowledgement, thanked him out of habit, and set the packet on the desk Dad left me. Morale hummed from the hallway. My phone vibrated with a driver's joke about donuts. I lifted the summons, exhaled once, and reached for a pen. The good kind that doesn't smudge when the next chapter starts. Syra answered their lawsuit the way a surgeon answers a bleeder. Steady hands, clean cuts, zero theater. Our counterclaims spelled out what the ledger had been whispering for months: breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, conversion, and defamation, each cause of action paired with exhibits that didn't need adjectives to stand upright. We asked for sanctions because the duplicative invoices and mailbox gymnastics were not accidents. They were a choreography. I signed the verification, slid the pen back into its case, and felt that strange calm I only get when paperwork stops pretending it's a suggestion and becomes a spine. Discovery opened like a warehouse door at dawn. Fluorescent, unflattering, honest. Blythe produced ledgers with timestamps so tight you could hear the seconds. Harper logged photographs of equipment nearly walked out the side. Micah's bank records arrived with user logs attached. And the receiver's reports stacked like bricks, each aligning with the next without needing mortar. We organized everything into a binder system that would make a librarian preen tabs for months, subtabs for transfers, and sticky flags for the moments where intent stopped being a rumor. The wall at Maze looked like a calendar had learned to breathe. Vivian's side sent a narrative that wobbled before it cleared the clerk's inbox. Redacted PDFs hid more than privacy. Margins shrank where paragraphs used to be. Metadata told on the author. When Syra asked for native files, they offered screenshots that looked allergic to provenance. The judge, who had the patience of a bus schedule, compelled full production with a paragraph that carried the weight of a gavel without the noise. He noted that spoliation wouldn't be tolerated and set a deadline that didn't blink. Minutes later, Celeste, on a hot mic in the hallway, blamed the paralegal for forgetting to keep versions. The court reporter didn't bother to cough. Depositions unfolded in a conference room with bad coffee and excellent acoustics. Syra's questions landed like, "Sutures, where were you? Who approved this? Which device? What time? Please read line 4. I answered in verbs and dates because adjectives rot under oath. When asked if I felt hurt, I said the ledger showed duplicate invoices on the 10th and the 24th, approved via hotspot ending in 3A, emotion replaced by sequence. Harper identified the buyer who had inspected our forklifts and servers, then pointed to the TRO. Blythe demonstrated the copy and paste rhythm of strategy memos. Micah explained acceleration in plain English that made my palms sting again with memory. Opposing counsel waved the phrase reputation harm like a scented candle, hoping fragrance would stand in for fuel. But the judge reminded them that creditors and employees outrank feelings in a business collapse. He referenced our wage schedules and fuel coverage during the default week, then asked counsel whether their clients understood that continuity is a fiduciary responsibility, not a mood. The courtroom air shifted from sympathy theater to maintenance manual. I watched Vivian stiffen and Celeste's pen start clicking in the staccato of an argument she couldn't script. We mediated with Dara, a woman whose neutral cardigan disguised the reflexes of a traffic controller. She separated us into rooms and told everyone to drink water. Syra laid out the range with the kind of math that makes bluffing boring. I allowed one concession without swallowing dignity. Mutual non-disparagement with teeth, meaning no subtweets. No, just sharing facts, and liquidated damages if anyone decided to turn my company into content again. Dara nodded like a metronome and went to carry numbers across the hall. I stared at the patterned carpet until it looked like roots. By late afternoon, settlement landed exactly where the evidence had been pointing since the first duplicate invoice. They released all claims. We released ours except for enforcement provisions. A defined portion would be repaid through Vivian's trust on a calendar that punished lateness, and a permanent bar kept them an arm's length from Atlas's corpse and Ariadne's living body. No admissions, no victory laps, just signatures arranged like a conventional ending. We added a clause requiring device preservation for a year. Syra's smile didn't show teeth, but I heard them click into place. Dara collected pens, told us to go get air, and filed the term sheet before anyone could misremember. In the elevator, Vivian asked if I was happy, as if happiness were a ledger item we could reconcile before the doors opened. I said, "I'm at work," which was both an answer and a location. Celeste avoided my face and watched the floor numbers rise like a countdown. Ruth texted a single heart that felt like permission to keep choosing boring excellence over public absolution. On the sidewalk, Rowan handed me a to-go cup and a list of tomorrow's onboarding. Somewhere in the distance, a truck downshifted into a sound that still feels like home. Back at my desk, the court clerk emailed, "Final order entered, settlement approved, receivership concluding under routine wind-down." I exhaled into the quiet of a room that had learned my pace and sat for a moment without moving. Then a second email slid into my inbox with a subject that turned the air sideways. "Estate reading sealed letter from your late father. Please attend." The invitation named a date, an hour, and a room that smelled of polished wood and last words, and for the first time all day I let the pen rest where I couldn't reach it. Keegan's chambers smelled like wood polish and quiet decisions. He greeted me with the same courthouse calm he'd worn through probate, then set a slim envelope on the table, my father's name in the penciled block letters he used on route maps. The red wax seal wasn't theatrical, it was practical, a promise that what waited inside hadn't been handled by anyone else. Keegan slit the seal with a brass opener and unfolded a single sheet, the paper thin enough to show the impression of a diagram on the back. He didn't read it aloud. He handed it to me, palms open, as if a passing of weight required ceremony but not witnesses. My father's handwriting walked the lines in steady strokes. He wrote that leadership is service performed in the open, that shortcuts bill interest nobody budgets for, and that math, not approval, keeps a company upright on bad weeks. He admitted he had worried about Vivian's appetite for image, how it could outrun prudence if no one stood on the brake. Then he asked me, without poetry, to protect the roots and the people who make asphalt meaningful. The impression on the back belonged to a sketch, and when I turned the page I found a tiny blueprint for a micro-hub he had never tried. 2 trailers staged near the rail spur, a generator cage, and a note about coffee at midnight because morale and efficiency share a bloodstream. He had drawn arrows between neighborhoods, calculating minutes saved if night crews owned their own dock instead of begging for space. I traced the lines with my finger the way you drag a memory into the present and felt an anchor click. Something between instruction and permission. I didn't cry in the room. I bought thermoses on the way out, the kind that don't leak when a truck shimmies, and drove to the warehouse with the letter folded into my planner. Night air tasted like wet cardboard and diesel, familiar as a childhood lullaby. Rowan and May were in the small conference nook with the leads, paperwork spread like a map of nerves. I read the practical part aloud. Service is work done on time. Shortcuts cost double. Trust the math, and left the rest inside my chest where grief can't confuse itself with strategy. They didn't clap. They nodded, which felt better. We built the test without speeches. 3 clients agreed to pilot the microhub for 2 weeks. Modest lanes that could teach us without punishing anyone if we were wrong. Lynn, our operations analyst, modeled fuel and time savings against weather, driver breaks, and the stubborn habits that make spreadsheets lie. She found minutes in places I had stopped looking. A left turn we could delete, a dead zone in radio coverage, a pallet jack that needed replacing to keep bodies from burning out. By the 4th night, the report stopped whispering and started singing. Turn times fell. Fuel burn eased. Tempers cooled. I mounted the letter behind a frosted panel in the conference nook, private but present, so his voice could breathe beside our numbers without turning into a relic. People could see the outline of the sketch and the slant of his handwriting, not the contents, and that boundary felt right. Legacy should be a handrail, not a leash. When someone asked what the panel hid, I said it was instructions for nights when the map argued with the clock, and we all smiled because every map argues eventually. The panel glowed softly in the lamplight, a lighthouse for decisions made after midnight. Late that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Vivian. A photo of the letter Dad had left her. The first paragraph highlighted in yellow. A line about letting go before love turns into management. There was no caption, just the image, as if she believed a quotation could perform repair. I set the phone face down and returned to the schedule board, adjusting tomorrow's doc assignments to keep the pilot humming. I didn't reply. Replies invite arguments that pretend to be reconciliations. Work, meanwhile, forgives nothing and rewards focus, which is the only sermon I'm qualified to preach. A competitor offered to acquire Ariadne strings attached. The offer arrived in a deck glossy enough to see my own caution reflected back at me. A regional competitor wanted Ariadne, and the number sparkled like a headline: premium multiple accelerated payout, earn-out, opportunity. Then I read the strings. They wanted my core team sideline to reduce overlap, night shift bonuses stripped to normalize compensation, and our no-yelling rule replaced with language about performance intensity. The page about culture called it rationalization. I called it subtraction. I laid the deck on Dad's old desk and felt my lungs vote no even as the math dared me to blink. Math, however, is loyal to no one's vanity. I handed the data to Lynn and asked for a 5-year model that didn't flatter. She built scenarios with taxes, clawbacks, earn-out risk, and the boredom of real maintenance costs. In her sheets, the premium crumpled like a paper crown. After taxes, after the synergies that meant fewer humans, after the probability that they would move the goalposts on year 3, the miracle shrank to a shrug. She showed me sensitivity analyses where a 1-point uptick in fuel or a hiccup in renewal rates turned their promise into an apology. "They're paying us with our own efficiency," she said. And I heard my father's pencil tap in agreement. Rowan volunteered to play bad cop, which for him meant unblinking courtesy and term sheets that defend people before profits. We pushed for carved-out protections, seniority honored, bonuses codified, training budgets immune, our privacy policy embedded, and severance that respected years of backs and knees. The offer didn't just shrink, it sulked. Their charm cracked in small, impatient ways: new deadlines, calls scheduled at awkward hours, a joke about sentimentality when I flagged safety ratios. When I insisted dispatch dignity wasn't a perk but a control system, their counsel blinked like I'd spoken an unfamiliar dialect. Customers quietly pulled me aside with versions of the same message: that buyer cuts corners. A traffic manager sent me a spreadsheet of missed windows from 3 cities under their portfolio and a note about claims handled like suggestions. A warehouse. Lead said he'd been told to turn a blind eye to small stuff if it meant quicker loadouts. None of it was scandal, all of it was erosion. Our safety record isn't a trophy, it is a promise not to make other people's nights heavier. I told them no. Not in a press release. Not in a speech on a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and contained exactly 1 sentence about stewardship. Then I called our A and B clients and reaffirmed every quarterly commitment, asking what would make renewals frictionless. Several moved up their timelines unprompted, 2 expanded lanes they'd been testing, and 1 asked whether we could copy our microhub pilot in a second district. "We like boring," he said. Boring arrives. Instead of selling, we signed a joint purchasing agreement for tires and safety gear with two friendly carriers, multiplying our leverage without marrying their risk. Margin improved anyway. Lynn updated the 5-year model and colored the cells the shade she uses for sleep better. I walked the yard at dusk and let the hum of refrigeration units remind me that applause is not an input. In my head, I wrote a note to Dad. I kept the roots. I ignored the applause. The math still likes us in the morning. Vivian forwarded a snarky article about women leaving money on the table, as if refusal proved fragility instead of discipline. Syra laughed and suggested I frame the email in the break room under a plaque that reads boundaries. I didn't reply to Vivian, but I did reply to Syra with a screenshot of our renewal board and the words, tables set. May organized a tiny team dinner, soup, bread, paper plates, no speeches. We toasted to boring excellence, to clean audits, to the sound a driver makes when a new fuel card works on the first swipe. It felt like investing in a future nobody claps for because it simply functions. I slept that night for 7 straight hours, an extravagant thing, and dreamed of pallets that didn't splinter and left turns that disappeared. In the morning, I found a single voicemail from the suitor's COO offering one last sweetener like a candy disguise for a hook. I deleted it, then stood at the frosted panel that hides my father's letter and read the shadowed outline of his microhub sketch. The arrow he'd drawn to a handwritten note, "Coffee at midnight," still moves me more than numbers with too many zeros. Profit without purpose is a costume. I'm done with dress up. Near lunch, Harper stopped by my office with the expression she saves for weather warnings that aren't public yet. She shut the door, set her notebook down, and kept her voice low enough to make the walls lean in. "There's a rumor," she said, "that Celeste is pitching a copycat startup to poach our drivers' same lanes, splashy slogans, promises about modern culture. She's shopping a deck and hinting at our rates." I felt the old heat rise and then step back, replaced by the calm eye. Keep for forks in the road. I thanked Harper, circled 3 names on my notepad, and reached for the phone as the cliff's edge sharpened into view. The rumor arrived like weather, not dramatic enough for a siren, too persistent to ignore. Harper said Celeste was pitching a copycat startup with a deck heavy on slogans and a promise to liberate talent. I didn't drown the office in speeches. We braced without bluster and built grip where it counts. Retention bonuses tied to clean safety logs went live with clear math and dates. Mentorship ladders paired veterans with newer drivers for paid shadow shifts. Promotion windows were posted on a bulletin board and a link, so no one had to guess how advancement happened. I wasn't trying to seduce loyalty. I was honoring it with process. People don't jump ship when they can see the helm and the horizon at the same time. Rowan walked the yard with a clipboard and a body mechanics expert, upgrading trucks with ergonomic kits that would outlast slogans, better lumbar supports, angled steps, anti-fatigue mats, and gel grips that made ratchets less brutal on wrists. May built a small flex schedule pilot for caretakers, slotting reliable drivers into predictable rotations that still met windows, because stability is a kind of raise. Lynn started sharing KPI dashboards openly on time percentages, fuel burn, claim rates, hours so everyone could watch progress inch forward like dawn. Transparency wasn't a press release. It was a mirror. When people can see the score, most play better because the game has stopped lying. By midweek, drivers began texting me Celeste slides. The fonts were expensive, the math was not. Growth lines soared without inputs, rates sparkled without cost assumptions. A culture page promised radical candor with a stock photo of people laughing at nothing. I thanked each person, filed the decks without commentary, and returned to schedules. Gossip is a sugar high, calendars digest, slower and feed longer. The only question that mattered was whether our Monday would still look like Monday on Friday. We were, and that steadiness beats any pitch that needs a drum. Syra sent a cease and desist for trade secret misuse, citing identical phrasing lifted from our training binders and a table structure that could have only come from our internal SOPs. We didn't post about it, we documented. Harper notarized the screenshots and preserved headers. Blythe added a tab to her ledger labeled Echoes and lined up timestamps next to timestamps until the pattern made its own accusation. Meanwhile, customers forwarded Celeste's outreach emails asking whether we planned to change providers. We replied with gratitude and Saturday coverage at no surcharge. The operational version of a handshake held a second longer than necessary. Loyalty, I've learned, is built in weekends. The rumor didn't end with a bang. It fizzled like a match in wind. The copycat site 404'd after a splash page that tried too hard. Jade deleted a thread that had bloomed briefly into indignation. A few drivers who had asked quiet questions thanked us for not making them feel disloyal for asking. I didn't screenshot the deletions or frame the retreat as victory. I worked. We handed out gloves that fit, fuel cards that swiped on the first try, and schedules that stopped moving when life needed to be predictable. Performance is the only clap that deposits. Ruth asked me to meet for tea at a bakery that smells like buttered patience. She stirred slowly, eyes on her cup, and said she followed Vivian out of fear, not belief, fear of losing status, of gossip, of being the last to know. I told her fear is a bad CFO, it hoards pennies and sets fire to dollars. She laughed, small and honest, and pressed my fingers with the same hand that once slipped me quarters for vending machines after school. Your father liked things that worked, she said. This works. I walked her to her car and watched the wind decide a few leaves were ready to go. We launched Dad's micro hub fully on a Thursday night, just as the moon shrugged itself above the rail spur. The trailers glowed like modest promises. The generator thudded steady. A table with thermoses and bananas stood where someone once would have put platitudes. On-time metrics climbed like a careful ladder. Fuel burn dropped because staging beats scrambling. Claims flattened, then started to behave. Profits didn't spike. They settled into a dependable hum. I trusted more than any hockey stick graph. When numbers stop needing adjectives, you're finally doing the work instead of advertising it. For the first time since the foreclosure notice under my mother's azalea pot, I slept 8 hours without my phone in a shoe. The morning was an ordinary miracle. Coffee that tasted like itself, inboxes without alarms, a message from Lynn with 3 green arrows and 1 yellow that would turn green by lunch. I walked the yard and let the air announce that trucks were warming up and nobody was panicking. Relief is quiet. I am learning to hear it. That afternoon, Vivian requested a meeting as family, not business. I said yes with Syra present. In a neutral room, during business hours, with an agenda and a clock. My heart didn't race, it arranged chairs. I have learned that love needs terms when history has invoices. I forwarded the invite, set the rules, and slid Dad's letter back into my planner like a compass that never argues with math. We met in a neutral room with carpet, the color of diplomacy, and a clock that clicked loud enough to keep everyone honest. Syra sat at my left, legal pad squared to the table. Across from us, Vivian arranged her scarf like a thesis statement. Celeste stacked her phone on a notebook as if Signal could summon authority, and Ruth folded her hands over her purse the way church ladies seal a prayer. Vivian said she wanted closure, the syllables polished. Celeste said she wanted credit, her eyes skipping over mine as if a camera were somewhere to serve. Ruth said she wanted peace, which sounded like the only request that didn't need a press release. I slid a slim portfolio into the center, tabs labeled for speed because ceremony drags when truth is simple. On top sat a mutual release, already signed and filed. No more threats, no more filings, no more paper shaped like weapons. Beneath it, a letter confirming the scholarship endowment in my father's name for CDL training, the dates and disbursement schedule printed without romance. Last, wrapped in brown paper, a framed route map lifted from Dad's planner, his notes still visible in pencil around a tight downtown loop. For your wall, I said to Ruth, and her mouth trembled the way old stories do when they find a home again. I gave you what you asked for, I told them, not raising my voice because clarity doesn't need volume. Money, titles, the appearance of control. I let the words sit, watched them measure their reflections in the glass. And I took what matters: people, purpose, continuity, routes that arrive, paychecks that land. A company that doesn't audition for anyone. Vivian's jaw tightened. Celeste's pen twitched like a metronome losing count. Ruth looked down at the map and traced a street I used to bike just to see the trucks turn. You took everything, Vivian said, low and rehearsed, a line she'd been saving for a perfect silence. Only the parts you kept selling, I answered, not unkind, because cruelty wastes time and I was done with overdrafts of feeling. I kept what he built to be held, not displayed. No one moved. The clock counted a small eternity and then released us. Celeste asked, brittle, whether I would ever admit I needed them. I needed you to choose the work, I said. And you chose the photograph. She looked away first, which felt less like triumph than an accurate inventory. Ruth cleared her throat, the sound of an apology getting dressed. She said she was sorry for not standing up faster, for letting fear spend our hours like loose change. I told her I stopped it because she once taught me to count change. Palms open, coins visible, the habit survived longer than the chaos. We didn't hug. We agreed to birthdays without business and silence without secrets. If something breaks, we say the noun before the blame. Vivian signed the copy of the release, pen pressing too hard into the paper as if pressure could revise ink. Syra gathered the documents, slid them into her case, and nodded once our private stamp. Back at the yard, sun leaning sideways, we rolled out folding tables and lit a grill that smelled like relief instead of performance. Rowan flipped vegetables with the competence of a man who reads manuals for fun. May arranged bowls of potato salad as if dignity were a condiment. Blythe arrived with a tray labeled like an audit vegan, not vegan, both. Syra handed me a pie with the dry announcement that it was compliant. Micah and Nyla brought a sheet cake iced with the word on time, which made the mechanics laugh. Harper snapped a photo of the crew and then put her phone away. Lynn taped a small chart to the cooler that showed the week's fuel burn sloping down like a quiet bow. We ate standing up, helmets hung on elbows, the yard humming behind us the way steady things hum when future stops being conditional. We toured the microhub as dusk began to behave like a promise. Cables coiled, dock lights pouring soft gold along the concrete. Rena, the photographer who understands how to catch usefulness without turning it into propaganda, moved like a respectful shadow, catching trucks sliding out exactly when the board said they would. No hero angles, no slow-motion swagger, just taillights threading into the evening like a sentence that knows where it's going. A dispatcher pointed to the schedule and said, "Look no red." The pride so practical it might have been a weather report. I walked the perimeter and touched the metal rail of Trailer 2, the way sailors touch hulls, not for luck, for accountability. When the yard settled to its nighttime frequency, I locked the office with keys that warmed my palm the way living things do. Inside, Dad's map glowed under the lamp, pencil marks haloed by glass, every arrow still stubbornly headed toward morning. I stood there long enough for the hum to tune my breathing, thought of the day they priced me like a receipt, and felt how far the ledger had walked since then. The building didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a vow I kept. On the closing shot, my voice stays even because drama burns too fast for the long road. My family betrayed me for money. I gave them what they wanted and took everything they could never hold. The camera doesn't chase faces. It lingers on the root board, the quiet thermoses, the framed map, a driver laughing into his collar, the door clicking shut with the soft certainty of work that will begin again before the sun figures out what to say. Stability, boundaries, and a future I choose, routes running, people paid, story closed. I locked the yard at dusk and finally understood. I didn't win a fight, I kept a promise. They chased titles and applause. I kept roots on time, paychecks on Fridays, and people treated like adults. The court stamped an order, but the real verdict was the hum of trucks leaving on schedule. My family sold appearances. I chose continuity, and it pays in quiet. Every single day. If betrayal priced me like a receipt, purpose turned me into the ledger that outlasts them. If this story gave you a steadier way to face your own family business, keep this table set, pass it to someone who needs it, and stick around for the next quiet win. Your support turns more messy nights into clear plans, more noise into order. Walk with me to the next route. Tap follow so you don't miss when the lights come back on. Question for you. When loyalty and livelihood collide, which would you protect first? And what's the very first action you'd take to prove it?